Good afternoon, evening. I'm here to talk about data and journalism and investigative reporting. My name is Jennifer LaFleur. I'm an editor at the Investigative Reporting Workshop in Washington, D.C. I also teach data journalism at American University. I've worked for several investigative nonprofits as a reporter and editor, most recently Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting in California and ProPublica in New York City. Before that, I worked for newspapers. I'm hoping to give more of an overview today about ways data can be used in data journalism and ways to get started. Who has used data in reporting? Anyone? Okay. Good, that's actually perfect. And tomorrow I'll get into more details on visualizing and creating data. So sometimes data starts like this in data. And also, just to let you know, these slides will all be available online, and I'll give you the link at the end so you know where to go to get them. Sometimes data starts like this. This was actually some reporters in Argentina wanted me to see their database, and they took me to the bookshelf with their database. We don't need data to do this to us. Data can help us tell stories better, not make things really complicated, and it's sort of like a superpower. Some of my students who go into newsrooms who can do fairly simple data things suddenly become very, very needed in their newsrooms because they know how to do a few simple things. By having a database, you have the whole population of something going on. You can show extremes, so what's the highest, what's the lowest, what's in the middle. You can combine data to draw new conclusions. One of the very powerful things to do with data is to join different databases together. I'll show you some examples of that. It can help you with breaking stories, and simple tricks can just make your life easier. But it all kind of comes back to the investigation and the story. I think sometimes we get caught up in bells and whistles and flashy things, but for me, data is a way to do investigations that no one else can do. Just some simple tricks that I have this database, and I gave this to my students the other day. This is birds and other animals that have struck airplanes. Very quickly, and it's not about statistics and numbers and all that, I can ask questions and think, I wonder what airline had the most of these. I wonder what animal hit planes the most. So very quickly I can ask questions of my data, of my records and my data. What the story actually looks like might vary. It might be a graphic. It might be a map. It might be some sort of interactive game. This is a Malaysian project on voting where they had an interactive game to explain the voting process. It might be VR. I think there was a session just before this on VR. It might be an audio story. This is from Reveal, where I used to work. This is a radio story about fires in California that we did long before the most current problems with fire there. It might be satellite data. We used a lot of satellite data to look at trends in fire, but it's also a very useful tool for looking at deforestation, for drought, and many other things. I'll get into many more details about that tomorrow morning, but wanted to just quickly show you a couple examples of that. It also can help change policy or solve problems. I had a colleague who was interested in tracking cases where they were unable to match missing persons with unidentified bodies. He had a specific case he was looking at, but there are thousands and thousands of unidentified bodies, missing persons in the U.S. My hope one day is to kind of broaden this across borders and make it more international. So what we did is we took government data, we put it online so that readers could search and then match cases that they think were probably a match. And in several cases, we had about 1,000 matches that readers put together. They are such good matches that DNA has now been submitted, so we can hopefully solve some of the cases. So these are the kinds of investigative stories with data that really can make a difference. The Washington Post has been tracking police shootings of people around the country for several years now. This is an example of data that they've had to go and build. There is no national database of police shootings. There's a few databases that say they get at it, but nothing comprehensive. And so the Washington Post every year spends a lot of time building this data. This is a very recent, this came out yesterday in New Jersey, of all of the fatal force incidents by police in every police department in New Jersey. So they took 72,000 documents from every local police department in their state and built a comprehensive database of all of these incidents. Mapping can also be a great tool. When we were looking at our president's proposal to build a wall between the U.S. and Mexico, we had to create the map of the existing fence and wall along the border. It could also be used to look at historical events. I did a project a few years ago looking at military who were involved in testing the atomic bomb. Many of them were made to stand just within a mile of bomb explosions. They talked about how they could see their hand. When they put their hands over their eyes, they could see their bones through their hand. And what I wanted to do was map all of these and get the data on all the men involved in those tests. My father was one of them, so I had interest in that. I also like to use data because I don't trust that a government agency actually knows how to analyze data. I've had many cases when an agency has a report that shows one thing, but when you look at the raw data, which I always try to get the individual incidents, it shows something else. So just getting started with data, it doesn't have to be a big, complicated thing. There are many ways where data can help you with simple tasks. If you have a tip for a story, think about how can you show what's going on? Who might have the data? What's the paper trail? Do any kind of records have to be filed? Sometimes what I'll do if I'm trying to find out about a topic, and I do this with my students too, is think about, does a report have to be filled out or a form get filled out? That report or form is a map to what data they might keep. So just an example, this is a bridge that fell down in China, but bridges fall down everywhere. They just have recently had some across the U.S. and in Texas and other places in the world. So if I'm reporting on this, I'm going to immediately think, what sorts of inspections do they do of bridges? So this is an example of a bridge inspection and what they keep on it, how high it is, what the span is. So this is a report, and I think they must put that report must at some point go into a database. I also will go on websites such as ARIJ18, and I'll give you information about this, or ARIJ18 or other journalism organization websites and get tip sheets about how other people have looked into this issue. This is an example of data from Latvia on bridge inspections. This is just raw data of bridge inspections in the US. And then very recently, one of the newspapers in Norway mapped all the problem bridges in their country. And if you look, the red and orange are actually the bridges that are in serious condition, and there's a lot of red and orange. So clearly they need to do some bridge repairing there. And even if you are at a point where there might not be a government database, there are often organizations of civil engineers that track bridges. There are hard copy reports of inspections. You might have to put those into a database. So there's opportunities even when the perfect database doesn't exist. So don't think that you have to find the one big federal database. There's lots of ways to deal with data in other ways. Sometimes we go from data to story. It's a little more risky because you don't necessarily know if that database will have a story in it. Okay, sorry. But I'm going to look, some databases, pretty much you'll always have something in, like crime data. You'll usually find, what's the highest and what's the lowest, and whether things are going up or down. So looking for patterns in the data by some of the key columns in your database can often show you what's in the data. What more do I need? What other reporting do I need to do? Because no data story stops with data. The data is often the very foundation, the beginning, to help you then go do more reporting about the topic. This is a BuzzFeed story I love. They used data gathered from detectors that can detect trains and planes and things to search for hidden spy planes flying over certain parts of the US and other places in the world. And that's where some artificial intelligence and other skills are now being used to do sorts of analysis that we couldn't do before. This is an example of, there's a student project at Arizona State University every summer where the students go out and they get the same data from every state in the country. They don't necessarily know what they're going to find, but this is one where they looked at food inspections and problems and safety in food, and did many stories about what was going across the whole country. This is another story that just looked at the toll of war on human beings. It's an interesting interactive. I'm going to go back and some of the interactives and the online stuff I will show you after I go through the slides. This is a German story looking at 198 attacks on refugee shelters there. This is an interesting story because this reporter wanted to look at dangerous drug interactions, but he didn't know enough about what combinations of drugs really would be harmful, so he worked with university researchers to come up with a sample of prescriptions that would be dangerous to see if pharmacies would fill them. This is an international story that used US data to look at how many terrorist groups and other criminals around the world get their planes registered in the US. And by looking through that data, they were kind of able to show this for the first time. This story from a few years ago was the Associated Press investigation. Basically, in the end, they ended up showing that many of the fish products that we consume were caught by slaves. Many of these slaves were held on islands in cages in Asia, and they ended up freeing something like 1,000 slaves that were held in cages because of this investigation. So this is one where it really had a lot of impact. They used several different databases for this. They looked at some business databases that track where ships are. They did surveys of the slaves once they were freed. They looked at patterns of shipping industry, supply lines. So a lot of different data went into this story that made such a huge difference for so many people. This is a smaller story, but it made a big difference. This Two of my reporters were interested in looking at drug rehab programs in the United States. They happened upon one where people thought they were going to go into a rehab program, but instead they were forced to work in chicken processing plants. And then if they were hurt, the company that started the rehab program, where they were getting no help and no rehabilitation, took their workers' comp money and sent them to prison because they could no longer work in the chicken plants. To do data, we don't have to just sit around and do numbers and data. We don't have to look like a computer nerd. It's a great tool for all reporters. The process for getting the records and the data, it's not all, unlike what my students think, it's not all magically online. Some data has to be received other ways. Sometimes it is online, but I'm always really careful. There's so many government agencies and organizations that put data dashboards together that don't really vet the data. So just be careful when you're getting data from one of those dashboards that you are very careful about checking it out. And tomorrow, one other thing I'm going to talk about is how to just vet data and know if the data are accurate. So sometimes these portals can be really valuable. You just need to be careful. This is a story using pollution data from South Korea, looking at the smog and the particulates in the air there. Sometimes you have to scrape it. Do you guys know what scraping is? Okay. So if you've ever had to go search on a website for something, imagine if you had to do it 2,000 times to gather all the data off of a website. Scraping is a method of writing a computer program that will automate that for you and pull stuff off a website much more quickly. We used that when I worked at ProPublica to look at pharmaceutical payments to doctors. Reuters used it to look at children who were adopted from other countries and then basically put up for sale on bulletin boards because the people didn't want them anymore. Often we have to go to the agency or go to sources to get the data. Or sometimes we have to build it ourselves or physically count things. This is a Tibetan story where they built data from news reports, observations, reports from people of all the self-immolations there. But by the end, they had a database so they could really examine some of the trends going on. This is a sports story that looked at all of the reports of food inspections in professional team stadiums and all the problems with the food in those concession stands. Some of my advice on this is to get your records and data early. Don't wait till you're on deadline. When I move somewhere and start working, I often get in touch with the government computer people and kind of just ooh and ah at how great their data is and get to know them. So when I do need the data, I know who to go to. Keep track of your work and stay organized. I have my students and my reporters keep a data diary because what happens when you're working with the database is you'll be working on it and then get pulled off to do something else. Or, breaking news happens and you'll get pulled off. And then when you go back to your database, you forget everything that you did. You forget the names of your files, you forgot what you did. So if you keep track of all that, it's much easier to come back to it later. It's also easier if you need to tell somebody else or an editor or a lawyer how you did your story. You have it all documented. Understand the process of what you're covering. Actually, I can show you this. Great example. I thought I'd show you guys. And the data contained information about the contractor and the amount of money. And then there was another field called status. And so the database had, AT&T, Dynamo, the company names, 200 million, 100 million. And then the status field said A or B. Well, in some newsrooms, they analyzed the data and just added up all the money to see who got the most money. I had a couple people who told me, status, that doesn't look that interesting. I'm going to ignore that field. What happened is, if status was an A, the amount of money was positive. If it was B, the amount was negative. So it was one of the most important fields in the database, and lots of people just ignored it because they didn't think it was interesting. So I tell everyone, get to know every single field in your database. Sorry about that. So understand the process, confirm and corroborate your data, and make it something worth reading, listening to, watching. I have reporters tell me, I don't want to do data because I don't want to write number. Well, nobody wants to read number. Data is often the foundation of really good stories that can be told with data as the foundation. Also keep in mind that data isn't just rows and columns like that. Sometimes it's traffic, sometimes it's food. There's lots of things that really end up being data. The elevator in my building was last inspected. Oh no, the inspection expired 2.5 years ago. So, I think there must be a database of all those elevator inspections. And I don't really want to go up and down an elevator every day that hasn't been inspected, but I don't really have a choice right now. This is a project that the Houston Chronicle did where there was a major hurricane last year. They had done a project where they collected 2,500 reports about the chemicals that are held at companies in Houston. And the point of the story was that there are very dangerous chemicals being held here. If Houston ever gets hit by a hurricane, which is very possible, or it floods, these chemicals are going to get spread all over the area and into the ocean. So what happened several months after their project ran? The hurricane hit, and mechanical failures, and chemical fires, and chemicals going all over the place. Mapping can also help tell these stories because you can overlay things like population and flooding and chemical spills. So mapping, which I'll talk a lot more about tomorrow, is a great tool for telling some of these stories. This is a project we did at Reveal because California was in a 6-year drought. We wanted to know who the biggest water users were in California. The state would not tell us. And so we used satellite imaging to calculate who the biggest water users were in the state. And we got it down to 7 people who are the highest likely water users in the state. Keep in mind that one of these houses used more water than entire towns in California that had completely run out of water and were having water shipped in. And I can show you that one a little later. But not everything has to be a map. We get excited about maps and then want to put everything on a map. Some of the tools, spreadsheets, which you can do a lot with a spreadsheet and it can make your life a lot easier. I had a student who was working in a newsroom this summer she was working in a newsroom where they had a spreadsheet, but then somebody was going with a calculator and calculating everything by hand, looking at the spreadsheet. So she was like a superhero after she showed them how to do it in 10 minutes. Databases, mapping, statistical analysis for doing more complex things like looking at correlations, looking at disparities. Sometimes you need something a little bit more complex than just counting or summing things, but a lot of stories are really just kind of counting things and looking at trends. Visualization tools, if you want to make display the data, what happens is you can't put every number in a story because it would be number, and boring. So visualizations and graphs can often help you tell the numbers better than you could do in the story. And there's also, as you start doing this, a million little tools, often that are free and open source, that can help you when you run into problems like scraping a website or extracting data from PDFs, cleaning data, visualizing data. There's lots and lots of tools out there that people have built to help out. Some of the resources, and again, I'll give you the website where you can get this presentation so that you don't have to remember all of these. GIJN, the Global Investigative Journalism Network, has a whole part of its site for data journalism tools. Investigative reporters and editors has lots of data and tip sheets. The Data Journalism Awards is an international award, and for me, it's just kind of inspiring to go and see what sorts of stories people are doing, and we can look at some of these. The Investigative Dashboard, which is a project of OCCRP, and then ICIJ's blog often has great tips for using data in reporting. So a little bit about tomorrow morning is I'm going to talk a little bit more about how to do building data when you don't have data and some more tools for visualizing data. And this is where the presentation is online. If you want to have it for later, my contact information. But I wanted to now kind of open it up to questions and kind of deal with some. Oh, I gotta. And I have one more opportunity for some training in Jordan upcoming, and then I'll take questions and we can discuss more ideas and maybe look at some of the websites I showed you. Do you want to?
Hi everyone, thank you Jennifer. I hope you found this very inspiring because there is actually an opportunity for you to do your own big data journalism projects if any of you are from Jordan, and also in Iraq. So, yeah. Yeah, now? Yeah. After this is very short, 2 minutes. So I work for Internews, and basically what I offer is one-year data journalism training programs in different countries. So I've done my full program in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Kenya, and Sudan, and we're going to start a program in Jordan and Iraq. And every one of my teams, the year after the program, has been a finalist for the Global Data Journalism Awards that Jennifer mentioned. So in Afghanistan, they were finalists because they looked at a prison database and found that everyone in prison for drug crimes was either a farmer or a driver. Okay, so they looked at everyone to see if there were any drug kingpins, any Taliban, and no, it was just the farmers and the drivers. In Pakistan, they looked at data on private schools and public schools and found out that children in private schools were failing national exams at the same rate as public school children. In Kenya, they changed the food sustainability policy because we found out that the same amount of money in emergency food aid could pay for the whole state's food sustainability strategy. So with a little bit of data in these countries, you can do very, very big stories that have very, very big policy impact. Whether you're collecting your own data, whether you're using the limited government data available, or working with NGOs on the data they collect. So I have flyers, so we've just today opened the application period for Jordanian journalists. And again, it's a 6-week program offered over the course of a year. So about every 6 weeks we get together, we spend a week on data journalism skills, then there's weekly homework assignments in between that I review, and then at the end, by the end of the period, you've produced 2 full investigations that again you can submit for different award programs. And again, the goal is to convince editors in every single one of these countries. There are now permanent data teams in media houses in those countries. So hopefully you guys will be the next generation changing the face of journalism in your country and opening data units. So if you can come find me after, I have flyers and the link to apply to all of those programs.
Okay, thank you. So before I go into any more examples, I wanted to see what questions you had, or if any of you have done data stories, to tell me about those, or share with those. Anyone? Yeah? Go ahead.
Just a quick question about how did you use satellite images to reveal the houses who most consume water?
So it's a little complicated. Let me go on over to the story. So I can go over to fire. So this was the satellite imaging data that we looked at looking at fire. And what we wanted to understand is kind of how California has been hit with a whole bunch of fires recently and before, and what we wanted to do was understand the process. I'll talk about the drought one as well. How the fires work and how they process and what happened in these areas. So we embedded satellite imaging into the story. So as you were reading the story, you could see how the fire progressed. One of my reporters, before he became a journalist, was a wildland firefighter, so he was very familiar with this. He also wrote software to process this data, but after the story came out, Google now has something called Google Earth Engine, which is a way of getting satellite data. There's also some tools. The data that we use for this is from what's called the Landsat data from NASA, but NASA does this all over the world. Every point on the Earth is photographed every 16 days. So it's possible to get good satellite data from lots of different places around the globe. And then on the water stuff, it's a little more complicated, and we actually had to talk to geoscientists to figure out what methodology. Satellite data comes from the satellites in what are called bands, and you have to understand what band contains what data. But there are bands that help you look at wetness and greenness, and using those bands, we were able to identify the worst violators of using more water in California than anything else. So, but a lot of this we didn't just know. We had to spend a lot of time talking to scientists and vetting our analysis with scientists, which we do on almost any story. You know, I've done a lot of stories looking at disparities in criminal justice. And in all of those cases, I do my analysis. I don't show my stories to my sources, but I go back and I vet my analysis with experts to make sure that what we're doing is correct and that we're using the right methodologies. And I'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow too, but I think especially places where you can't get a lot of mapping data or data hasn't been gathered on the ground, there are a lot of ways to use satellite imaging to look at trends that you might not otherwise be able to get. We would never have gotten the data about who was using the most water because they wouldn't release the names, but using this technique we were able to find those people. Okay. What other questions do you have? Anyone? Anyone have any other stories they've done that they want to talk about or share? Okay, let me just show you a couple other things then. Show you one other thing here from Reveal. One other thing we've done quite a bit of is because we had a radio show, so showing data on the radio was a little bit of a challenge. So one of my reporters wrote some tools to turn data into music so that we could do audio graphics on the radio. And so what we were able to do is using, and he's got some free tools, which the link is going to, I'll do more with that tomorrow, but I can also send you the link, so that you can actually hear the earthquakes. So the deeper, the longer, the stronger the sound is, the bigger the earthquake. And these are reduced so that over a few years is condensed into a few minutes. But it also shows you how more frequently the earthquake started occurring. And this is in an area that had a lot of oil injection, and that's what was causing the earthquakes. So earlier, they were, every so often, not that strong. Then they get stronger, and more often. Diversity in company managers in Silicon Valley. We've used that technique to look at the border wall. We've used that technique to look at, there was one of the mass shootings at a nightclub in Florida. So for us, it was a great way of getting the impact of data on the radio. Okay. Other questions? Yeah. Oh, sorry about my hair.
Thank you so much. Actually, I work as a data journalist.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
So what stories have you done? Do you want to tell us about some stories you've done?
Sorry.
Do you,
Yes, actually, I didn't until now publish anyone because, in my country, it's a new kind of journalism. But I am interested in data journalism. The problem is, in my country, I can't collect the data. So sometime when I need to make story, sometimes I have to move from this story to another story because I didn't have a good data. But when I search about the data, I discover something dangerous or something very important. So am I right when I move from the issue to another issue? When I do the story of data?
well, I mean, if it's just not gettable and you can't get the data at all, in a lot of places, there isn't necessarily like government data that covers a topic, but there are other ways to get at the data. sometimes, just building your own database from observations or news stories or documents can get at that. And sometimes you can actually use some scientific sampling methods so you don't have to gather every single one. That's one thing I'm going to talk a lot about tomorrow is techniques for when there is no data. How do you build a database? I know many years ago I was doing some training in Argentina, and they had no data available there. But a team at La Nación, and if you've seen their data journalism stories, they do amazing work, and a lot of it's been from scraping websites and from building their own databases. And finally, 1 year ago, the country now has a Freedom of Information law that actually covers data, and so they're starting to be able to do more and more stories. So I think.
So you mean much search about?
Yeah, and I think just connecting with other people who have done this, and I'm part of an organization, Investigative Reporters and Editors. I'm on the board, where we kind of all learned from each other long ago, so we're always willing to help each other out. So connecting with other journalists, usually other investigative reporters are very willing to help out. So, and I'm happy to talk about stories too. So, thank you. I'm just going to show you real quick the data journalism. So the Data Journalism Awards, I just kind of look here for inspiration sometimes. This is the International Awards for Data Journalism. If we go to the short list. Okay, this isn't showing up very well in here. It's a good place to, the links aren't showing up very well right now, but if you just go or Google Data Journalism Awards, there's lots of different ideas. So they give awards for the best open data site, the best data team, individual portfolios, data visualizations. So there's lots of ideas here if you're just kind of trying to get inspired. On IRE's website, what? A little bit, but I'm happy to talk now about that as well. This is the Philip Meyer Awards that Investigative Reporters and Editors gives, and this is the Data Journalism Award. And going through some of the award winners here at IRE.org is also a great place to get ideas and just see what other stories have been done. One nice thing about IRE's site, if you ever had to enter their contest, you basically have to write a document that explains how you did your story. So it's a great place to get more information on stories that have been done. And as far as open data, I mean, so many places are pushing for open data, but a lot of times they keep dual data sets where they have their data that they actually work on, but they're required to do an open data dashboard, so they send some data there, but it's not always the same data. So we were looking at fire inspection data in California, and the city of San Francisco had an open data portal with fire inspections, and the fire department had a database of fire inspections, and they were very, very different. So you just need to be careful that they're actually keeping those open data sites current. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
When you sometimes collect data from scratch and build your own data, and I don't know how often you you ask scientists or experts to be on board with you while doing this. I mean, how often do you receive a counter attack from people you uncover, maybe saying that this is not a conclusive evidence? Because it's, I mean, even for the example you shown for the water, it's still relative for some people to tell you this is not a conclusive evidence.
Well, we actually went to every single house we identified and asked them if they disagreed with what we found. And actually the person who ended up being the highest water user in the state came forward saying yes, and here's my bill, and showed us. So we do a lot to vet data because we don't want to assume that. I did a project when I was at ProPublica showing disparities by race in who got pardons from the president. And we wrote what we did this in a lot of big projects where we write a white paper, like an almost scientific paper of our methodology, and send that around to experts. We also give that to the targets of our stories. We don't give them our story, but we give them our findings, because we want holes poked in the story before the story ever publishes, and that's why we do that. After we did our project on presidential pardons that, you know, eventually resulted in the pardon attorney getting fired, the Justice Department put out a call for a $9 million contract to analyze their data. Like, I'll do it. But because they really had never looked at it before. So that's one thing that often happens is agencies, they don't even know if you're right or wrong because they've never even looked at their own data. So. Okay. Okay. Other questions? I'm going to be around for a few minutes, so if you have other questions, I'm happy to answer them. I'm going to continue doing more building databases and visualizing tomorrow at 9. Otherwise, I will be around at the conference. I'm also happy to give you contact. I'm also happy to, if you email me with questions, get back to you. So thank you very much.